All right, welcome to week 4 of our Holy Week studies. We're getting ready this evening to look at the first session is going to be on the Last Supper. The second session is going to be on Gethsemane. But let me recap where we were these last 3 weeks, just in case you don't completely recall. We started with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but I suggested that really far more important than the triumphal entry was his triumphal exit. Once we concluded with that, then we talked about the temple cleansing, at which point we realized that God really was serious about the Jews being the light to the world, and Jesus made sure that the Gentiles had full access to God there inside of the temple grounds. On week 2, we looked at some of Jesus' teachings, beginning with his parables, and we noted how the parables that Jesus told that last week of his life began to take on a much more serious, although yet still very hopeful tone. And then in the second session, we looked at his end times teaching, and we discovered that while we today tend to think that we're living on the verge of the end times, that Jesus insisted that with his coming to earth, with his incarnation, and certainly during his ministry, that it was in him that the end times had begun, which means then that the church has been living in the end times now for 2,000 years. Surely by now we should have some sense of how we should go about doing that. In week 3, we looked at 2 of the groups of Jewish officials that Jesus would have had some interaction with during the time of his ministry. The first group that we looked at were the Sadducees, with whom really Jesus had very little, if anything at all, in common. The second group that we looked at were the Pharisees. They were a group with which Jesus had much in common. In fact, it would be easy to even suggest that he was himself a Pharisee. So now let's turn to the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. We're going to look tonight at the Last Supper that Jesus has with his disciples, and then follow up, as I suggested a moment ago, with the time that he has in Gethsemane. This day of Maundy Thursday, it's not Monday Thursday, it's Maundy Thursday, is a word that comes from the Latin mandatum, or command, and it refers to the new command that Jesus gives to his disciples in the midst of washing their feet, telling them that he wants them to now fulfill this new command that he gives to them, that they are to love one another. The feeding of the disciples in the Passover meal is an event that does not occur at all within the Gospel of John, although there are some hints and some little side notices or glances to the event occurring within the Gospel of John. But what does occur within the Gospel of John, the meaning of the Last Supper, appears within John chapter 6. If you're not familiar with John 6, that's where the feeding of the 5,000 occurs, and it's that event that has all of the meaning that the other Gospels include within Last Supper. Final thing that I want to mention really just in starting is that the Passover meal that Jesus has with his disciples on this particular evening provides a foundation for what we know as Holy Eucharist today, as well as for a lot of the meaning that we import into that meal. Now, just prior to all of this meal beginning, sometime earlier in the day, Judas had left the rest of the disciples and had cut a deal with the chief priest in order to betray Jesus sometime this particular night. All right, the Seder meal. Seder meal is one of those things that Christians during this particular generation find much interest in. But those of us who are older than just the last generation, we grew up not hearing much of anything at all about Seder meals. And there's a reason for that. But what I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes is what kind of an influence Seder might have had on Holy Eucharist. The Seder meal is based on words that we find in Exodus chapter 12, where God speaks to the Hebrews and tells them what they are to eat and why they are to eat it as they get ready to leave Egypt. There are 6 foods that have a variety of symbolic meanings that are a part of a Seder meal. You can see them on the screen here, perhaps. There is, for instance, horseradish or some kind of a bitter herb, and the symbolic meaning of that is it reminds the Hebrews, or today the Jews who eat that meal, that they had years of bitter slavery that they had to endure. Or there is, for instance, the haraset. It is an apple mixture that is all bonded together, and it reminds them of the mortar that they had to produce to be able to hold the bricks together. Or there is the matzah, the unleavened bread that they would eat. This reminds them that they had to leave, ultimately, Egypt in a hurry, in haste, and so there was not time to leaven their bread normally. Well, the rules for a Seder meal are actually something that did not exist during Jesus' lifetime. The rules for a Seder meal, what would be the questions that would be asked, the answers that would be given, even the foods that would be eaten, those rules occur within what is known as the Passover Agadah, which is a group of writings that are culled from the writings of rabbis after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 A.D., all of which means then that the Seder meal did not exist during Jesus' lifetime, and therefore the Last Supper that Jesus experiences with his disciples cannot have been a Seder meal. Now, Christians are interested, as I mentioned earlier, in the Seder. And it's natural, I suppose, for us to be interested in a Seder meal because we've just tended to assume that that's what Jesus ate with his disciples. Even though that's not the case, I'll say a bit more about how it refers to the Passover meal. But one item here, just as we conclude this section, there are a lot of Christians today who want to have a Seder meal at some point during Holy Week because they, as I said, assume that Jesus must have eaten this with his disciples. But I think really it's rather inappropriate for Christians to want to have a Seder meal in order to experience what Jesus and the disciples would have experienced, not only because he didn't actually eat a Seder meal, but because it's a Jewish meal. And Holy Eucharist doesn't have any kind of firm foundation in Seder, even though it does have a firm foundation in the Passover meal. It's as inappropriate for Christians to eat a Seder meal, at least a Seder meal, without having Jews present who have invited them to take part in it, as it would be for Jews to say, hey, I want to experience Holy Eucharist so that I know what a Christian feels when he has that meal. That too is inappropriate unless the Jews have been invited by a priest to be able to share that meal with a Christian congregation. Never mind the fact that is it really even Holy Eucharist if it doesn't have the blessing and prayer of great thanksgiving prayed by a priest prior to the distribution of the elements. If that doesn't happen, is it really Holy Eucharist? Isn't it just bread and wine? Well, be that as it may, I think I'm getting ahead with my, there we are, back on point. All right, the Jews did not know a Seder meal until at least 70 A.D., so this could not have been the Last Supper meal. Prior to the destruction of the temple, however, the Passover meal did have to be eaten inside of Jerusalem. I don't think that means that Jews who, for instance, may have lived in Galilee did not eat a Passover meal, but officially, for it to have been a Passover meal, they had to actually eat the meal inside of the city limits of Jerusalem. And then after they ate the meal within the city limits, they then had to spend the night within Jerusalem itself. Now recall that during Passover, the number of people who are actually inside of Jerusalem has expanded tenfold. So the usual 80 to 100,000 residents in Jerusalem would have expanded during Holy Week, during Passover, to 800,000 to perhaps as many as 1 million or even more persons. There was just no way for all of those persons to be able to actually spend the night within the walls of Jerusalem. And so officials during the first century found a convenient way to take care of that. They would, on Passover night, simply expand the city limits to be able to include territory that was outside of the walls of Jerusalem. They didn't allow it to go miles and miles outside, but it did, for instance, include the Mount of Olives as part of the city during that night. And that will come back into play in our second session this evening. There are a number of things, even though Jesus did not have a Seder meal with his disciples, there are some things that are similar regarding the meal that he has with his disciples that we know as the Last Supper and what we would know as a Passover meal. For instance, the dipping in the bowl or the wine that would have been drunk. Usually water was drunk with a meal by Jews in the first century, but wine was served during festive occasions, and the Passover meal was certainly a festive occasion. Another thing is that the Passover meal was to be eaten while the Jews reclined at the table. They were in repose. They did not eat it standing. They didn't even eat it sitting. They ate it reclining around what was known as a triclinium. So that means for us who have grown up with Da Vinci's Last Supper and all of the other paintings that are based upon that, Jesus was not sitting around a table with his disciples eating the meal. He was rather reclining around a table with them. Well, there are roots in the Passover meal that Eucharist has, but there are also things that are not similar between these two meals. For instance, Passover meal is a meal that is only eaten once a year, whereas Holy Eucharist is something that in many churches we eat every time we gather for worship, whether that's once a week or even multiple times during the week. Bread is another difference that occurs within the church in Holy Eucharist. For the first several centuries of the church, leavened bread, not unleavened bread, was used by the church. It was not until almost the year 700 that the church in the West, not in the East, but only in the West, trying to make the meal that they were eating together as Holy Eucharist look much more like Passover meals themselves, that they began to actually insist that the church use unleavened bread. Eastern Orthodoxy has always used leavened bread and continues to do so to this very day, and there are many Protestant denominations that still use leavened bread as well. There are things that are similar. For instance, the concept of the bitterness of slavery still exists within the liturgy of the Western Church. We remember the bitterness of our own slavery to sin in the confession that we pray prior to the meal. We still have a focus upon the sacrificial lamb, although we do not eat lamb as part of the meal. We do remember the sacrificial lamb. And there's a focus upon gratitude that takes place within this meal as well. Not only for the daily bread, the manna that God provides his people, but also in the wine, the festive occasion that wine offers to us, the festive occasion of remembering our salvation and the gratitude that we have for that. There is a Trinitarian structure to the Great Thanksgiving prayer that the priest prays over this meal. The first part, if you'll recall in that, it's talking about the great acts of God the Father. The second part is followed by the great salvific acts of Jesus Christ. And then the third part is the epiclesis, in which we call upon the Holy Spirit to not only make this be the meal in which we are able to dine upon Jesus, but also to empower us to be able to go forth in service as his people in the world. That has lots of similarities to the Passover meal that the Jews would have experienced within the first century, in which there were questions that were posed and there were answers that were given that reminded the Jews of the experience and explained the symbolism of not only the questions and so forth, but also of the meal itself. And certainly the Great Thanksgiving does that as well for us today. Well, in the midst of all of this, you might think that the disciples were right on target with Jesus, listening to everything that he said. But if we read the passages in each of the Gospels, we discover that that's not at all the case. That in fact, Judas has already set everything up in order to be able to betray Jesus, and there is an air of betrayal that is in the air even at the meal itself. And when Jesus broaches that topic, every single one of the disciples, instead of wondering who it is, are trying to say, well, it can't be me. Surely not I, Lord, they say. So there is this sense in which each one of the disciples has been thinking about betraying Jesus, and Jesus catches them off guard when he broaches the topic. And even if it weren't for the matter of betrayal, every single one of the disciples, after Judas actually leaves, are sitting there debating and discussing among themselves which one of them is the greatest, which is itself a betrayal of everything Jesus has just been talking about with them and what the Passover meal is all about. So instead of talking about humility and service, they are engaged in the betrayal of greatness. And that brings up the last topic for this session, and that is the foot washing. Somewhere during probably the portion that was known as the fellowship meal, or more of an actual meal that would have been served as the Passover meal, and then before the more symbolic portion of it that we tend to think of as Passover, Jesus takes time out. He's frustrated undoubtedly to some degree with the disciples and the discussion that they're engaged in. He leaves them where they are talking about greatness, takes off his outer garment, dons a towel, gets a small container, a basin in order to be able to wash feet, and then plops himself down in front of Peter. And what follows in terms of his discussion with Peter and through Peter with each of the disciples is a call to service. It's a call to service that is based upon the receipt of grace that they received from Jesus. And he tells them in the command that will occur shortly in the Gospel of John, that the love that they share among themselves and the care that they offer to one another will be the kind of love that convinces the rest of the world that they are truly Jesus' disciples. This is a repudiation of all the kind of self-advancement that they've just been talking about in terms of their greatness. And he says, instead of that, you need to recognize that to be truly great, you need to humbly serve. The foot washing, every single one of the disciples are there, including Judas. It will be shortly after the foot washing that he will finally leave. I'll say more about that in the second session. Jesus will say to Peter, when Peter says, "Don't wash my feet," Jesus will say to him that if I don't wash you, you can't have any part of me. And it's often been understood by the church that this is some kind of a condition, that you've got to have your feet washed if you're going to be able to have something to do with Jesus, when in reality it's something very different. It's really an offer of grace. So if I may try to enunciate the difference, it's not, if I don't wash you, you can't. It's rather, if I don't wash you, you can't. Well, as I said, Judas was present at the meal. He was present even at the foot washing. The simple fact that Judas was present at the meal, the Last Supper, the precursor to what we know as Holy Eucharist, that, if there is anything, is a declaration to the church that the meal that we share every time we gather for worship is a meal that should be open to all who are present, even if there is someone or many persons present who are diabolically opposed to all things that Jesus represents. Even to them, the table is open, as it always should be.